This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor starts this week's programming with our cattle market update. Today, he provides information on the futures reacting to the grain market and the latest from the March Meat Demand Monitor. We also hear today from several K-State experts with the Beef Cattle Institute. Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Phillip Lancaster, and Bob Larson are joined today by Mississippi State professor Amelia Woolums to share their advice on managing bottle calves. We end this Monday show with our wildlife segment for the week. And this week, we are joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew joins us today to share information on various perspectives that can occur when the topic of rewilding is brought about. He explains what rewilding is and how the process plays out with policy in Kansas. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're beginning this week's programming with our cattle market update for the week. And joining us for that today is K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. So let's start with some of our fed cattle, market results we saw in the last week or so. What did we see there?
To remind everybody, this is Monday after Easter, so happy Easter after the fact to everybody. But we do have a holiday effect in this story as part of that, too. So AMS called the fed cattle market through Thursday at 174. That definitely continues the uptrend that we've seen for at least 6, if not 8 weeks now. Compare that with the board. April live cattle was 171, up about $3 from the prior week, and up about $9 since the third week of March. That's all fed cattle. Kind of the parallel information for feeder cattle is also positive. So AMS called the Pratt market, most weight classes up this past week. I wrote down 3 just to give us a wider span of examples. The lightest weight lot I wrote down was 71 head, weighing 577, went for 250. Intermediate weight of 661, a little over 100 head, went for 235. And then the largest lot that I wrote down, heaviest, was 928 pounds, weighing 124 head, came in at 182. Those would all be up, certainly from a month before, and most of those would be up from the most recent week. We look at the board for feeder cattle to round this out. April closed above $200. So right at 201, up about $1 on the week, also about $6 higher since the third week of March. Some of that is we've had a little bit of pullback in corn. Bigger part of it, I think, is the tightening cattle supply is hitting. And I think and I'll talk box beef in a minute, but some of the beef buying is occurring, I think, in advance of some holiday. We're on the front end of grilling and so forth. I always interject, my brother lives in Austin. They're already grilling there, but the rest of the country is going to catch up in the months ahead. And I think there's a lot of chasing of what is expected to be less available beef pounds.
Sure, and we're starting to catch up now with our temperatures here starting to warm up. And I know I'm looking forward to 80-degree days. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I am.
Yeah, I'd like to interject some rain in the middle of that for all our listeners, I'm sure, nodding their head. But it is time for it to warm up, and it is warming up.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the bucks beef cut out there, so let's go ahead and talk through those.
Yeah, so on Friday, USDA closed out the choice cutout $291. That's about $9 higher than the Friday before. It actually came in the highest since January of 2022. I'll come back to that in a moment, but the select came in at $276, up about $5 on the week. When we circle back to the choice, we can compare to how we started the year, and I think this is instructive about what categories are leading the growth and which ones aren't, is compared to January 3rd of this year, the total composite's up about $4. So the rally is fairly recent. The rib category is down 15%. All the other categories are flat or up. I'm highlighting that because I think the rib has been under stress. Hopefully some seasonal return to grilling and so forth will help with that. We do get our ribs from the rib. But what I want to hone in on is loin is up, brisket's up, short plate, there's a little bit of an export kind of story there, is up, and then chuck and round are basically flat. There's a mixed bag across all those different primal-based cutout numbers on a mix of food service, export, and domestic. Remember, these are all wholesale values that blend all three. Foot traffic at restaurants has been down. In a minute, I'm going to share a little bit of a good story from March on that. But we've had about 6 months where people have been tightening their financial belt due to inflation. And there's been a little bit of a pivot, I think, from steak towards ground as part of that as well. And we're seeing that in some of those numbers.
Sure. Is there any seasonality to kind of the trends you see in people eating out opposed to eating at home too?
Yes, there is. The foot traffic does differ, and some of that is tied to your credit card as well. So we tend to see people splurge around the Christmas holiday, and then, say, the third week of January, they start seeing a credit card bill, and people start eating out less. I didn't say anything about COVID, didn't say anything about inflation. It's like typical patterns there.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising. Like the month of February is one where we tend to see a pullback because people are trying to save that month because they, quote-unquote, overspent in December. And in the month of January, their credit card bills caught up with them. So that drives some seasonality in the recent months we're looking at.
Sure. So now that we're in April heading into, May, not too long from now, we'll kind of see maybe some people recovering from that and getting more active in their spending.
Yes. And with that, there's ongoing signs that some of the inflation story is moderating. And I'm going to use that to segue to our meat demand monitor.
Yeah.
But that'll probably make at least some in our country more comfortable eating out as well. So the March meat demand monitor was the kind of last thing we'll summarize here. We're sitting here early in April. Most of our listeners know this is a beef and pork checkoff survey-based, it's a checkoff-funded, survey-based project here at K-State. It's an ongoing effort. We always have this shortly after a month ends. I can put out the information on it. Retail demand, so grocery store for at-home consumption, was a mixed bag. So ribeye steak, ground beef, bacon, and chicken breast were down in demand March versus February. The other categories we'll look at were flat versus up. All of those categories remain down compared to March of 2022. So I've been saying that year-over-year decline for several months now. Again, that's I'm interjecting that even though we have this pivot towards home, willingness to pay has declined as people have been tightening their belts. Food service demand, so away from home demand, actually for all 8 evaluated meals, and again, we have ribeye steak, ground beef, chicken breast, pork chop, and baby back ribs are the main protein ones that are in that list. They were all up in March compared to February. And I haven't been able to say that for several months. Hopefully that continues in the months ahead, like we kind of teed it up earlier. Mother Nature and getting past the Christmas credit card effects and so forth will help us there. The recovery isn't where it was. We're not back to pre-pandemic levels, in part because we never got there. And then we had this roughly, I always peg it back to about Labor Day is when the main inflation response has occurred. But that category in particular, I think, is really important to watch in the next 3 or 4 months.
Sure. And I'm going to go back to kind of that retail demand here and discuss that a little bit with you, Glenn, because steak, ground beef, bacon, and chicken breast, that seems like those are very popular items to buy at the grocery store. Why do you think we're seeing a demand there since February?
Yeah, no, they are. It's a continuation of past trends. So for several months, we've had a decline in most, if not all, of those that you rattled off. And I'm going to stick to my opinion on, for the most part, I think they're products that are wanted. I mean, we had like an 18-month or longer period where they were in strong demand until roughly Labor Day of 2022. And, I'll pick on ribeye steak to make my point here, but they remain, quote-unquote, expensive compared to some others. So to the extent the average U.S. resident, and there's a lot of diversity in all metrics in our country, but I'm talking averages here for a moment, is still trying to improve their financial situation, I think that's weighing on the meat category still. So it's a mixed bag, retail, and the good news in March was food service traffic went back up, but that's another average statement. I don't know how much that is, people getting back to traveling, business travel, and other things that is pulling it up, even though maybe half the country still isn't back to normal foot traffic. Yeah, that's a long answer, and it's a very good question. I want to be clear. There's nothing that, in my assessment here that suggests those beef, pork, or chicken products that I alluded to have an image problem or a quality problem. Or there's none of that because there hasn't been major news on that front. There hasn't been concerns, and we're coming off of a very strong demand pattern until net wages took a hit because of inflation. And I honestly think that's just a continuation of that. I sound like a broken record for about 6 months, but I think that's continuing.
Sure. And then at the end, you always like to highlight some of, the unique information that comes out of this meat demand monitor. And this week you wanted to kind of talk about younger generations maybe purchasing something a bit unique compared to others. Yeah,
so let's talk a second about ground pork. I think this is relevant for lots of reasons. But one is Pork Checkoff is one of the funding partners on this. And the pork industry has spent a fair amount of resources in recent years increasing awareness of ground pork, doing advertisements and recipes of how to use it as an ingredient on its own. So it's not surprising there's been some success because it's been a focused effort. The second reason, before I give you the numbers, that's relevant for all our listeners, is the ground category in general. So ground beef, ground pork, ground chicken, ground turkey, ground anything protein is always of interest, and there's always the capacity for consumer to switch from ground X to ground Y. And at times we blend beef and pork or whatever, right? So understanding this is relevant whether you are in the pork space or not, because it it is important. And we do see during net wage decline periods, people's interest in ground go up, kind of expense of other categories. So that's all a backdrop for this. So what did I bring together? We asked, how often do you eat ground pork? Several other questions about ground pork too. But the main thing I want to share today is millennial and Gen Zs. So millennials are those born between 1981 and 96, and then Gen Zs are those from 97 forward that are adults in our assessment. We don't ask kids, just 18 and older in this exercise, are way more likely to consume ground pork. And even more narrowly, they consume ground pork more frequently. So I ask, never, once a month, once a week, and the like. And over a third of millennial and Gen Zs say they have ground pork at least once a week. Now, conversely, Gen X, which are those born between 65 and 80, and the baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964, would be well below a third of them saying they have it at least once a week. So I think there's this, I would not necessarily call it cultural, I think it's generational difference, is an openness to using ground pork. We ask how many use it as a main entree versus an ingredient, and it's basically split between the two. So there's a lot of people that use it as an ingredient, thinking tacos or making a meatball, a different kind of meatball out of it and so forth. I think it's a success for the pork industry is one of the reasons I interjected. But secondly, I think it's also an excellent example of the broader meat category continues to evolve. If we go back far enough, chicken wings were a waste, and they're far from a waste item today. That's a long statement, right? But things do change. And the ground pork category is worth watching, not just because the pork industry is putting a lot of resources in it, but as beef production continues to decline in the next couple of years, and most likely with it, ground beef becomes more expensive because of supply side pressures, I think ground pork will probably become more and more of interest, and maybe some blending products between beef and pork will be talked more about. So I hope that's a useful update for our listeners.
Absolutely, yeah, an interesting one for sure, how these trends play out. So thanks for providing information on that and the rest of our cattle markets today, Glenn. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor joining us for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and our next segment now comes from our friends over at the Beef Cattle Institute from one of their recent BCI Cattle Chat episodes. Anyone that has ran into an unfortunate circumstance that one way or another has led to having to manage and care for bottle calves knows how exhausting, yet also rewarding, the process can be. With that being said, our experts today, K-State's very own Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, Brian Lubbers, and Bob Larson, are joined by Mississippi State professor Amelia Woolums to provide their best advice on how to manage a bottle calf. Their advice ranges from what milk replacements to feed, the cleaning of bottles, and more. Once again, we'll hear from them now.
What are some of the things to think about when let's say I've got a cow that didn't take her calf, and I end up having to raise it as a bottle calf? What are some of the first things you're thinking about there?
Well, first thing I'm thinking about is nutrition and getting some milk into that calf and getting him going. And so thinking about what kind of milk replacer you're going to use and those types of things. And so one of the things to pay attention to is the type of protein that's in the milk replacer. So there are milk replacers that are based on plant proteins like soybean meal, and there are milk replacers based on milk proteins or whey protein. And that whey protein is much more digestible in a young calf. Their gut has a much better ability to digest that whey protein than soybean meal protein. And so look for a milk replacer, especially in the first 3 weeks of life or so, that is whey protein based.
Whey is way more digestible.
Exactly.
I see where you're going.
There you go. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Good job. So, Amelia, and you have looked at some of this too, and you have people that come in, clients that have bottle calves. What are some of your recommendations?
Absolutely. Very important to mix that milk replacer up correctly. It may not seem like a little bit more or less water makes a difference, but if you don't get enough water into that milk replacer, you can have some real serious health problems. The other thing I've been starting to suggest to people is that they might consider getting a colostrum replacer and add a little bit of that to the milk replacer. Now, stick with me here for a minute. What I'm saying is that the calves will not absorb the colostrum like we normally think, but it will just coat the intestines and help decrease infection with bacteria that might cause diarrhea and other health problems. And it's been shown that as little as if you give the milk replacer with 10% colostrum added, that can make a real difference in health. And one producer told me once that what they did was that they'd pour their colostrum or colostrum replacer in an ice cube tray, put it in the freezer, and then just break a couple cubes off and drop that in their milk replacer. And that's a way to help protect your bottle calf who might be at increased risk of diarrhea and other health problems.
That's a great idea. How long do you feed that?
You know what? If you can afford it, or if you can get the colostrum or colostrum replacer, I would think for the first 2 to 4 weeks of age would be all right, because that first month of life we know is when those calves are at particular risk for diarrhea. And those diarrhea agents, if they can't attach to the intestine, they can't cause diarrhea. And if you've got a lot of antibodies in the intestine binding to them, then they won't be able to attach and cause diarrhea.
Since we're talking about diarrhea, Brad, the other thing...
I enjoy talking about diarrhea.
Yeah, I know. The other thing that I always talk to, and because bottle calves aren't typically... It's not routine for a lot of people. And so one of the things I always kind of talk to clients about is managing the cleanliness of the preparation, the bottles. If this isn't something you're doing, treat this like food, right? So, it wouldn't be uncommon to see, a bottle that somebody left a little bit of milk in, and you would be surprised how fast bacteria can reproduce in a little bit of milk sitting at the little bit of a bottle. And if you just put the next feeding right on top of it, you're feeding that calf bacteria. So I really stress for people about the cleanliness of the preparation of the milk or milk replacer or colostrum, and also the equipment that they're feeding with. So things like the spoon, the whisk, whatever you stir it with, and the bottle itself. Make sure that you keep those really clean, hot water, even a little bit of dilute bleach water, and then go back at it again.
Yeah, and don't forget the nipple. Because that
absolutely
is easy to not get as clean.
And the thing is if you have multiple bottle calves at once, multiply what I just said by 2 or 3. You need to be transmitting from calf to calf. So, yep.
Okay, this is my question, because I've had to do raising a bottle calf, and my first question is, how soon can I stop feeding milk? How soon can I transition them to grain safely? Phillip?
Well, so probably, earliest as far as age goes is probably about 6 weeks or so. But I want to get some starter feed in front of those calves much earlier than that. Probably start putting it out there at about 2 weeks of age. Just put a little handful out there, put it in a place where they're going to find it. One thing I've found is that those calves will eat that starter feed off of a raised pan that's up there about the height of the bottle or whatever you're feeding. They don't. If you put it in a pan on the ground, they tend to step on it and walk on it and don't even pay attention to it. And so they eat it better if you got it raised up off the ground. And I particularly like a textured feed, meaning not pelleted, so that it's got more texture. It's got texture to it. It's got flavor to it. It's got molasses on it. And that textured feed adds scratch to the rumen. And so that starts to develop that rumen. And so they'll start eating some of that before they even start to eat some hay, and put a little long stem hay out there as well. But then as far as weaning, really the best way to wean them is not based on age, but based on starter intake. And so you'd like to have that calf eating 1 to 2 pounds a day of starter before you take the milk away.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said you're going to kind of stage that. So when was the first time you want to expose them?
I said about 2 weeks of age is when I would start to expose them to starter.
And then you said earlier the earliest we could wean them is 6 weeks, but a lot of times that's probably closer to 60 to 80 days.
Yeah, you would push it probably longer than that. But calves less than 6 weeks, from the research I've seen, they can't increase their starter intake. They just don't have the capacity to do that. And so when you take milk away less than 6 weeks of age, you're really limiting the nutrition of that calf.
Yeah, because that nursing is actually changing their gut and how their gut works. And then through that period, you can't transition them much sooner. But I want to talk about the amount. So how much, and let's back up to, let's say it's a 3-day-old calf. We've got them started. They're doing great. How much should I be feeding them? Is it the standard? Is there a standard amount I should be feeding them?
As far as milk replacers, is that what you're talking about?
Milk replacers, sorry, yeah.
So some recommendations from the dairy industry, about 10 to 20% of birth weight. They may not be eating that much at 3 days, but that's kind of my target to work them up to, and then decrease from there. And if you get them worked up, if you go up to like 20% of birth weight, you probably want to step them down as far as weaning them, and not just take it all away at once.
Yeah, and I think step down as far as weaning, regardless of how much you're feeding, probably makes sense. But you're saying 20% of body weight, so 2 quarts twice a day. Do I need to get more than that?
With ours, I push them up more than that. You start with 2 quarts twice a day, and then I work them up to 4 quarts, and then start to bring them down.
Amelia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that would be what I would have thought too, exactly what Phillip said. I was wanting to ask Phillip about hay. You know, he mentioned putting a little long stem hay in front of the calves, but I think some producers don't understand that at a certain age they can't get much good out of hay as a feed. Is that right, Phillip?
Yeah, so their rumen is sterile when they're born. There's no bacteria in there, and so they have to create that population, and that comes from the environment. It comes from sometimes if a calf is with their dam, some of that's coming from the dam, and then it's just coming from feed and stuff that they're eating in general. And so they don't have the population to digest that forage very well at an early age, but they will still nibble and eat on it. And that long stem stuff in the rumen scratches the wall of the rumen and starts to develop those rumen papillae and the absorptive capacity in the rumen. And so we still want to get some long stem hay into them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that starts to help the process and as you get closer to that weaning, because as Bob said, you want to get them weaned. But what we've talked about is getting them started on milk replacer, kind of building that up over time and then being able to decrease it down, which is challenging because that's the hard part, right? Labor-wise and expense-wise is getting them going. But if you've got a bottle calf, keep a close eye on them, because the 2 diseases that we do see commonly are, we talked about respiratory disease earlier, but also scours. And a lot of times the scours is one of the big ones in those calves. So maintaining that biosecurity, which is what Brian talked about, keeping that bottle clean.
Once again, those were K-State experts Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Phillip Lancaster, and Bob Larson, joined by Mississippi State University professor Amelia Woolums, providing advice on managing bottle calves. If you are interested in hearing more from this knowledgeable team of experts on all things beef cattle, like you just did in today's show, be sure to check out their 2 podcasts. Their 2 podcasts, BCI Cattle Chat and Bovine Science with BCI, can both be found on their website, which is ksubci.org. BCI's Cattle Chat focuses more on topics like you heard today, general beef cattle topics, mostly geared towards producers. But if you're looking to dive a bit deeper on some of the research areas that the BCI team focuses on, Bovine Science with BCI is your show. There, they break down the research that they actively work on quite regularly and summarize it in an easy-to-listen-to format. So based on your needs, either show might be the perfect match for your podcast listening needs. Once again, both of those podcasts can be found on their ksubci.org website, or you can simply go to the show notes of today's show, which can be found at agtoday.net, as always, and find the links there. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be back with this week's wildlife segment with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Today, Drew focuses on the topic of rewilding, the various perspectives that can come about when that topic is brought up. He also discusses policy in Kansas specifically and how rewilding could play out here in our own state. We're rounding out today's show with that coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we're ending today's show with our wildlife segment. Joining us today for that is K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. So today we wanted to talk through a recent study that you found, but it's specifically focusing on perspectives around rewilding.
It is. So rewilding is this idea within the conservation community that in order to have ecosystem integrity, we need to have not necessarily all the animals, but all the ecological processes that were there historically.
Sure. So in instances like Kansas, where we've talked about some of those gaps in ecological systems, kind of something we could think about.
It is. And, one example of that might be large predators, but another parallel would be bison being absent from the plains. But one of the arguments against rewilding is that through management, especially in heavily managed areas, we are basically replacing some of those ecological processes. So we can graze cattle in a way that mimics bison grazing. So that's an example of how that rewilding process can occur without having to reintroduce a critter.
these rewilding topics, there's a lot of different perspectives, chatter that goes on when it comes to these topics. And I know you recently came across a study focusing specifically on those perspectives.
I did, yeah. So this specific study is looking at people's perspectives towards the reintroduction of lynx in Scotland. And just to kind of get to the nitty-gritty about what they found, there were basically 5 perceptions. One of them they called Lynx for Change. These folks were supportive of lynx reintroduction and felt that lynx could facilitate ecosystem restoration. There were also folks that they called Lynx for Economy that felt that reintroducing lynx would attract tourism, which would pump money into hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and that sort of thing. The other end of the spectrum that was no lynx, and these folks were strongly opposed, and they feel that humans are fulfilling the roles of the absent large carnivores. And then Scotland is not ready, supported a conversation about reintroduction, but basically felt that there were socio-ecological barriers like predators getting into trouble by killing sheep and that sort of thing. And then there was another middle-of-the-road group that was called We Are Not Convinced, and basically they weren't satisfied that there was a case for the biodiversity gain to be made, but they were interested in further research about the topic.
Sure. So just some diversity there and kind of taking those 5 perspectives and thinking about maybe cases here in the U.S. That's possible, right?
It is. Anytime we think about wildlife management, there's always going to be lots of different perspectives about any topic in wildlife management. And when I was reading this paper, I saw a parallel between this study and the fact that the government funded a study to look at how people think or feel about the reintroduction of these lynx. That's very similar to the process that we have in Kansas with the Fish and Game Commission that would be the public's voice in any wildlife regulations that would be made. The opposite end of that spectrum is when we have ballot initiatives or direct legislation that require that wildlife be managed in a certain way or that we reintroduce things. And so the thing that popped into my mind when I was thinking about that are the upcoming wolf reintroductions in northern Colorado. So in 2020, there was a ballot initiative that was approved that mandated that the state figure out how to reintroduce wolves in the northern Rockies.
Sure. So in Kansas, like you said, we have those kind of checks and balance systems, but ballot initiatives aren't completely off the table.
They are not. And then the direct legislation, I think, is the other thing that we have to consider because that takes biologists out of the process of deciding what's appropriate, and it can also value the opinions or beliefs of a group with a lot of members that doesn't necessarily represent a large geographic area. So if we think about the wolf ballot initiative in Colorado, that was mainly supported by urban residents, but the impacts may be mostly felt by livestock producers who occupy a broader geographic area but are lower in number. And so we need to be careful about making broad decisions that might impact one group more than another, even if we have more people who believe a certain way or another.
Sure. Some interesting concepts here, Drew, and I'm sure these will be applied through further conversations that we have here in the future. But thanks for sparking this interest in this area for us today.
Yeah, hopefully it's a good discussion and hopefully lots of our listeners think about it.
Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts ending today's show with our wildlife segment. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.